Hey babes, happy Thursday. Welcome back to the YouTube channel. For those of you who are new, welcome. I'm Jessica Ash, a functional nutritionist and just general hormone nerd. I love connecting biological truths and really educating you about your body so you can understand and implement easy principles into your life that will help you have a better quality of life. If you like what I talk about in my videos, remember my online course, Fully Nourished, is really the blueprint to restoring your metabolism and balancing your hormones using nutrition, and really expands on all the principles I talk about throughout all my content. But with that being said, let's get started. Now this video is actually our fourth video in the Hormonally Respectful Fat Loss series. So if you haven't watched videos 1 through 3, I highly recommend watching those before you dive into this one. But in today's video, we're actually going to talk about how to create a deficit, because there are a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about calories in, calories out, creating a deficit. And I really want to talk about how do we actually go about creating a deficit, because we've talked about, when fat loss is appropriate and how our body actually loses fat. But how do we actually, if we're ready to go and we've created a strong foundation, how do we actually go about accomplishing hormonally respectful fat loss in the least stressful way on our bodies? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So before I dive into creating a deficit, we need to really talk about what a deficit is, and then how do we actually track if a deficit is working for us. So when I say deficit, I'm just referring to consuming a little bit less energy than your body is using. That is really what a deficit is referring to. So you can see, if you are really aware of the pro-metabolic approach and you understand your metabolism, you can see how that in and of itself, consuming a little less energy than your body is actually using, is a stressor. So, that might be like, wow, that might seem really stressful for the body now that I understand hormones. And that's because it is stressful. And that's why I've been trying to emphasize for you guys over and over again that it's really important to be in a place where you're ready, and that fat loss and hormone balance don't always come at the same time. They're not always synonymous. It's because sometimes you actually have to throw your hormones a little bit off in order to lose fat. And so that's why it's important to have a really strong foundation and be resilient to stress. But once you're there and you're like, I'm ready to, encourage a little bit of a deficit, I'm ready to start focusing a little bit more on fat loss, you do need to be paying attention. So I think that's really important, because a lot of people are just like, oh, I'm just creating a deficit and I hope I lose fat, I hope I lose weight. But you have to do some type of tracking in order to make sure that what you're doing is working for you. So, you've probably heard me talk a lot about metabolic markers, tracking your temperatures, your pulses, and just overall how you're feeling. Your sleep, your hair, your energy, your mood, your brain function, all of those good things. It's important to really check in with our bodies and make sure that we're doing well. We don't want to lose our appetite or anything like that. But in addition to actually making sure our body's doing okay and consistently checking in with our bodies, we also need to actually make sure that the deficit that we are creating is working for us, or is getting us the fat loss that we want. Because sometimes we can do a deficit that's just a little bit too little and it's not enough to encourage fat loss, or we can do a deficit that's actually too much and it's also just increasing our stress hormones and kind of working against us. So there really is a sweet spot for a deficit, and you don't want to create more of a deficit than you need, and you obviously don't want to create less of a deficit than what you need either. And this is where a lot of women go wrong. They think that more is better, and they oftentimes are like, oh, I've cut my calories by 200. Oh, I'm not losing weight fast enough, so I'm going to cut by another 200 calories. And then they're like, I'm not losing weight fast enough, so I'm going to cut by another 200 calories. And this is really where the yo-yo dieting and restriction and metabolic damage comes in, because you're not actually tracking your progress, and so you really are not making empowered decisions. You don't actually know if you're losing fat or not. So it's really important to be tracking something when you are in your deficit. So I highly recommend doing measurements and actually using centimeters. So get a soft measuring tape that's made for sewing and actually measure your waist, your gut, your hips, wherever you store fat. It's really important to kind of take note of those things and maybe measure once a week or once every 2 weeks to make sure that you're moving in the right direction. And progress is going to be really slow, so you don't want to see like huge jumps or anything, but you do want to make sure that your deficit after like a couple of weeks is moving you a little bit slowly in the right direction. If you like to use the scale, which I don't always think is the most accurate way to track fat loss, because you can lose weight without losing fat. You know, it can be water from your muscles, carbohydrates from your muscles. It can be really hard to track actual fat loss from weight, but if you like to track your weight and you like to weigh yourself and that's not like triggering to you, then it's a really good idea to weigh yourself at the same time every day, usually in the morning after your bowel movements, and weigh yourself every day and then average the week's weight out. So you take all of your weights from the whole week, you add them together, and then you divide them by 7 so that you see your weekly averages rather than you focusing on each day's weight. Because what happens is from day to day, our weight really does fluctuate depending on what we ate the day before, our hormones, the time of our cycle. And if we're just weighing ourselves sporadically, we're gonna feel really all over the place, because that's not a great way to track progress and see consistent changes. So if you're going to use a scale, make sure you're weighing yourself every day. I personally prefer measuring tape over a scale. And then 2 other really powerful ways to kind of track your progress is through photos or how your clothes fit. So I think it's a great idea to take some photos every maybe month or 6 weeks or so. You really want to make sure that you have a visual representation of what you looked like, 4 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, 12 weeks ago, because sometimes changes are really, really small, and it can be really hard for you looking at yourself to see changes visibly, but that doesn't mean that they're not happening. And so this is where photos can really be helpful, or just using the way that your clothes fit. But you do have to be tracking in some way, or you have no idea how to know if your deficit is working for you, and you're gonna not feel very confident about the decisions that you're making. Now, moving into how do we create a deficit, the old adage of calories in, calories out, it doesn't. So a lot of people will say it doesn't matter, and then a lot of people will say it's the only thing that matters. And I'm in neither of these positions. I'm actually in the middle. It does matter, but it's not the only thing that matters. And here's why. Because there are so many things that affect how our body uses energy. That's what calories are, right? Units of energy. And the whole point of healing your metabolism or restoring your metabolism is teaching your body to use energy better, to increase thyroid function, to increase your use of calories at rest, so that your body has plenty of fuel and uses that fuel to do all the jobs it wants to do. And there are many things that can manipulate the way that we use energy. Minerals, our macronutrient balance, so our protein, carbs, and fat balance, the actual nutrients we're getting into our diets, because we're not eating traditional foods and we're eating a lot of fake foods. If our cortisol is high, it's going to stimulate our belly fat cells to be a lot more sensitive. And then if our cortisol is chronically high, it can really affect how our liver stores blood sugar. And so that could really affect our blood sugar levels, which could increase insulin resistance. So there are a lot of factors that can really manipulate how our body is using energy, and if it is preferably using it in the moment or storing it for later in the fat cells. And it does take time to strengthen the metabolism, like I talked about in the last video. Like, it usually is a really good idea to create a strong, solid foundation before you start attempting fat loss, because the better you're using energy, the easier it will be to lose fat once you get in a deficit. But at the end of the day, to lose fat, you do have to give your body an incentive to tap into the fat stores. And this is really what a deficit does. If you're consuming a little less calories than you're using, it's forcing your body to tap into the stored energy that is in your fat cells. And, at the end of the day, like we've talked about in this series so far, is fat loss is stressful on the body, right? We have to make sure that we do have a strong and resilient foundation, because at the end of the day, when we do start to tap into those fat stores and use what's inside of them, there is energy stored, absolutely, but there's also, possible toxins, estrogens, all types of things that could have been stored in the fat cells that our liver is going to have to break down and metabolize, that our digestive tract is going to have to carry out of the body. And so we want to make sure that all these systems are working well, or at least as well as they can be within reason, before we just attempt to tap into those fat stores. So let's talk about the 5 ways that I personally like to create a deficit. And I kind of treat it almost as a prism. You can look at things from all angles, and there's no black or white. There's no right or wrong in this case. Some people choose to create a deficit in multiple ways. So they'll maybe combine a few of the things that I'm about to talk about together to create an overall deficit. And before I go into how to create a deficit, I just want to let you know that the amount of deficit that you need really depends on where your metabolism is at. So I highly encourage, like I've talked about in the past couple of videos, to create a strong metabolic foundation and get up to your maintenance calories first. So slowly get your calories up to a place where you can maintain your weight, and that might be a little bit of a heavier weight than you're comfortable with, probably 10 to 15 pounds over what you're comfortable with, but you don't want to be actively and continually gaining weight. You want to get to a point where you can eat the most amount of calories with no more weight gain and more plateauing. And this is a good, strong foundation to get to first before you cut your calories. Because if you're already in a deficit, which many women are spending years and years, if not their whole lives, in calorie deficits, it really is going to lead to having a more sluggish metabolism, and you're going to have to cut your calories even lower to lose fat, which is going to be even harder on your metabolism. It's going to lower your body temperature. It's going to lower your metabolic markers. It might mess with your sleep. It might mess with your libido and your mood. And so you want to actually, when I say create a strong metabolic foundation, it's focusing on balancing blood sugar and getting the right nutrients and getting all your macronutrients. But it's also about getting your calories up to a baseline point, so that your body can comfortably maintain its weight at its maintenance calories. And if you don't know what your maintenance calories are, I actually talked about this in my macros video, so I highly recommend checking that out when you get a chance. That one goes a little bit more in depth on how to calculate your macros and what each macro is for, and the goal with macros. So I recommend getting up to that maintenance first, and then start creating your deficit and actually look for creating your deficit. And each one of these ways to create a deficit have different time frames. So some things are going to be a little bit faster than others, but a lot of times the faster the fat loss, usually the more hormonal, I don't want to say damage, but just the more hormonal impact it's going to have. So if the slower you go, oftentimes the healthier it is for your metabolism and your hormones, as is most things in life. You want to do things slowly, gradually, not with haste. So that first way to create a deficit is actually to work on your metabolism, restore your metabolism, heal your metabolism, so your body is actually using energy better. These are the women that are playing the long game. So this often is going to take the longest time to get to your goal. However, there are women that just choose to give their body what it needs, give it space and give it time, and they do see that this eventually does lead to fat redistribution and also fat loss. And what I mean by this is, as you work on creating really strong foundations, like balancing your blood sugar, getting a better balance of protein, carb, and fat every 3 to 4 hours, making sure you're getting your nutrients from the right sources, so focusing more on whole, dense animal foods and plant foods that are easily digestible, and then getting minerals and vitamins in, and then focusing on your other non-food nourishment like sunlight and sleep. What happens is, over time, your body now doesn't feel like it's stuck in that famine. It's not conserving as much, right? It now feels like, hey, it's safe to burn. Your stress hormones are down. Your thyroid hormone is finally up because your liver is converting T4 to T3, and you are finally now using energy better. Now, this is a process, right? Especially if we have not been using energy well for years and years and years. It takes the body time to, first of all, lower stress hormones, and then feel safe, and then slowly start to raise thyroid function and to increase the use of energy, to focus on all the things it needs to be doing, like ovulating and nervous system health and thinking and breathing, all the things your body is doing in a day. Restoring those systems and nourishing every single one of those systems takes time, especially after years and years of undernourishment. But after a while, the body does start to balance out and the body does start to thrive. And this often takes a year or 2 years, sometimes a little bit more, but oftentimes I see women around that 8-month to a year mark are like, wow, my body's really shifting and changing. And even though I haven't done anything different, my body's finally starting to respond to me. And this is really what this means, is your body is now using more energy at rest than it was before. And so it might even be easier to create a deficit because Or you might actually naturally be in a deficit because over time, as your metabolism increases, if you don't increase your calories to meet that, then you might actually get into a deficit without even thinking. So this is probably my favorite way to create a deficit, but it's oftentimes the most frustrating way and the way that requires the most patience. And so most people don't want to approach this, but this is probably the best way for people who are really hormonally sensitive or maybe struggle with period loss as one of their first signs of stress. Maybe they have autoimmune diseases or they're just generally more physiologically sensitive. This is usually a better way to go about it, to just give your body the time and space it needs to really restore itself and give it some space to go through the changes that it needs to before it starts to naturally tap into those fat stores as it feels safe again. So restoring your metabolism is actually one of the first ways to create a deficit because, as your metabolism heals, your need for calories will go up, but if you do not change the amount of calories you're eating, you might naturally fall into a deficit. The second way, which is also a little bit more of a time-consuming way and kind of a long game play, is by building muscle. So the second way we can create a deficit is by building muscle. Now, building muscle is kind of like building a house. It does not happen overnight, and it just requires day in and day out consistency and just slowly working and laying things brick by brick by brick. It takes a workout to break your muscle down, and then, for the 48 hours after you build muscle, you're eating to replenish, and the body's going to rebuild itself a little stronger than before. And then it's this constant: when you work out, you tear those muscles down, and then the 48 hours after, you nourish yourself well, and your body builds back a little stronger than before. And so it really is a process, but as you build muscle tissue is some of the most metabolically active tissue. And the interesting thing about muscle is it really loves and has an affinity for free fatty acids. Now, we've kind of talked about, and we've touched on this, is that when there's fat in the bloodstream, it can make us less insulin sensitive because our body now wants to burn some of that fat in the bloodstream, and so it turns away glucose and takes in fat. But when your muscles are constantly in the state of rebuilding themselves, the muscle cells do have an affinity to actually take up some of those free fatty acids. This is why strength training is one of the most effective ways to help with insulin sensitivity and getting your body more sensitive to insulin and use blood glucose better, because those muscle cells are actually going to uptake free fatty acids from the bloodstream so that your other cells that like to burn glucose can take up glucose. So I love strength training, and I think everyone should be strength training regardless of where they're at, unless they're in a completely burnt out, adrenally burnt out state, and they need to rebuild and rebuild a strong foundation. That is kind of the exception, as some people are in such a state of stress, they've gotten to such a place of undernourishment or burnout that they really need to focus on building a strong foundation for maybe 6 months to a year before they start strength training again. But once you're in a place where you can tolerate strength training, it's a good idea to start doing some type of muscle training. Now remember, strength training is using weights, and your body weight does count, right? Your body does weigh something, and so things like push-ups and squats, just with your body weight, is enough to start building some muscle. And then eventually, once you've worked on your form and you've gotten your strength up, you can add extra weight like dumbbells and barbells and kettlebells and resistance bands and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's really just about working to create stronger muscle. It's not about trying to kill it in the gym. You don't have to do intense, high intensity training. That actually usually works against you because you're tearing down muscle using adrenaline. You want to do that slow, heavy strength training that really does help you build muscle, kind of sticking around in that like 10 to 20 rep range and making sure it's challenging enough to build, but not going so hard or so ham in the gym that you're constantly sore, you're constantly pushing too heavy of weights. Like, you really want to find that sweet spot. But strength training should be a part of your fat loss goals or your fat loss journey. It really does help you get to where you want to go faster, because it's one thing to lose fat. Like, losing fat is great, but if you actually want to change the way your body looks and reshape the way your body looks, then that's going to require building muscle. And so I highly recommend adding in strength training as part of your deficit and using that as a tool in fat loss. But that is the second way to create a deficit, is because as you increase your strength training, you're going to increase your body's need for calories, and you're going to increase your calorie burn at rest. Now, the third way is just to be more active. Now, this kind of goes in with the last one, but if you're like, I can't strength train yet, I'm not really in a place where I can strength train, I don't feel ready to strength train, maybe you're just too busy to strength train, guess what? You can still move your body, and everyone needs to be moving. I mean, if you're a sedentary person, you've got to be walking a good amount a day. I say like 7,000 to 10,000 steps a day should be the goal. And you might need to work up to that, but it's a really good idea to make a habit of walking more and just moving your body in general more. Park your car farther away in the parking lot and walk. If you're going to another store and it's close enough in walking distance, walk there. You don't need to drive there. Choose activities for fun during your free time or on your days off that do require some movement, at least for a part of the day. It does take work to build the habit of putting more movement into your routine, but it's absolutely necessary in order to create a little bit of a deficit if you don't want to cut your calories. So it's a pretty easy way to create a deficit, because the more you move, the more calories you will burn, and the more likely it will be that you're in a deficit. So, just remember that there are other ways to create a deficit besides, going into the gym or cutting your calories extremely. Just something as simple as moving your body more and walking more and standing and sitting up more and just moving your body in general more can really help you get towards that fat loss goal a lot quicker. The fourth thing I wanted to bring up, and I have talked about this before in a lot of my work, but I especially expand on this in my macronutrient video, it's get better macro balance. Now, a lot of people, as they enter this nourishing journey, they really just need to focus on the general rules of protein, carb, and fat and eating every 3 to 4 hours. But once you've been in this world for a while and you've kind of got that down, it really is time to dial it in a little bit. Especially if you're trying to achieve fat loss or some other goal, health goal, it is important to know where you're at. And now a lot of people will tell me like, well, do you have to track calories or do you have to track macros? No, you don't have to, but it can be an incredibly empowering tool to check in with. And this is why I love using the app Chronometer at least once in a while to kind of just check in to see how much protein, carb, and fat I'm eating throughout the day, but also breaking it down for each meal. But a lot of women, I would say the majority of women, the mistake that they're making is they're doing not enough protein. They are doing way too much fat, because fat's easy to overdo and it's easy to get enough fat in. And then oftentimes they're either doing too little carbohydrate or too much carbohydrate in relationship to the protein. But to me, the carbohydrate should really revolve around the protein. So protein in and of itself actually will increase your metabolism quite a bit, and this is the macronutrient that many women are not getting enough of, and so that is actually impacting their metabolic rate, and they aren't even realizing that just getting more protein is actually going to help them lose fat quicker. So sometimes just getting a better macronutrient balance and emphasizing the protein and the carbs and kind of taking some emphasis off the fat really does automatically decrease the amount of calories you're getting, because fats are so calorie dense at 9 calories per gram, whereas carbs and protein only have 4 calories per gram. But you're also creating a different metabolic profile when you are consuming a little less fat and more protein and more carbohydrate. So I highly recommend for people who are trying to achieve fat loss, before jumping into the next tip that I'm about to talk about, which is going to be a calorie deficit, I highly recommend just taking the calories that you're already at, your maintenance calories, and try to manipulate them a little bit. So increase your protein, increase your carbohydrate, maybe lower your fat a little bit depending on where it's at, and see if just doing that consistently for a few weeks helps you achieve a little bit of a leaner physique, or changes your measurements at all, or changes your weight at all. Because a lot of times, I've seen this again and again, just by increasing protein and doing some strength training, women are automatically building muscle a lot quicker, which is burning more calories at rest and increasing fat loss. And it's much easier than being hungry all the time, or being in that like calorie deficit, which is just really not fun to do. And then that fifth way that you can create a deficit, which is probably my least favorite way, but is sometimes necessary, I'm not saying it's not, I think there's a time and a place for it, is to actually bump down your calories a little bit and create a deficit by just eating a little bit less calories. Now, like I said, with macros, For me, it's better to lower fats a little bit and increase protein and carbs, because that will automatically decrease calories a little bit and possibly push you in a deficit. I think that's a much more comfortable way to create a deficit. But if you are like, this is not working for me, I've done it consistently for 4 to 6 weeks and I've been strength training, I'm moving my body more, I'm working on my metabolism, meaning you're getting plenty of minerals and nutrients and sleep and sunlight as best to your ability, and you're also now focusing on your macronutrient balance and nothing is budging, at this point it can be appropriate to create a little bit of a calorie deficit. Now I want to just give you guys that reminder of, if you're in a calorie deficit and your body's fighting you every step of the way and you feel puffy and inflamed and you're not ovulating anymore, or maybe your period is super PMSy and your mood is grouchy and you just feel awful, you're not sleeping well, that's up to you to decide if your body's fighting you enough for you to sit down with it and say, you know what, you're not ready for this deficit yet. You're not ready to handle the stressor of this yet. But I highly recommend to just pay attention to your body when you enter a calorie deficit or put yourself in a calorie deficit, because sometimes the body really isn't ready and it can be a really miserable experience for people who aren't ready. Now, when it comes to deficits, I actually only recommend cutting about 300 calories maximum. I'm not a big fan of calorie deficits more than 300 calories. Now, I'm not saying that you have to cut 300 calories. Some people don't even need to cut 300 calories from their diet to lose weight, but some people do. And this should not be pulled from one macronutrient group. So you should take the overall calories that you want to be consuming. Let's say you're consuming 2,000 calories right now, and bump it down to like 1,800 or 1,700 calories, and then recalculate your protein, carbs, and fat and keep them in balance with one another. Like, don't pull 300 calories from just fat alone, or just carbs alone, or just protein alone, which I see a lot. Like, that's not a good way to go about it. You want to still have that macronutrient balance, just with an overall a little bit less calories. And then if you, for whatever reason, are not experiencing, a half a pound to a pound of fat loss a week, which is probably the most realistic goal, or seeing a difference in measurements, because some women just don't really see changes on the scale at first. They only see changes in measurements just because muscle growth will mess with your weight. So if you're not seeing any movement or any budging, I highly recommend creating a deficit in other ways after that 300 calorie deficit. So at that point, I would add in strength training or more movement, or work on my metabolism a little bit more. I honestly would not go too much below that deficit. And then if that's not working, then your body's just saying, hey, I'm not ready to lose fat, and you want to just focus on building a strong foundation and maybe come back to fat loss 3 to 6 months from now. Because at the end of the day, like, more is not better, and you're not going to get more results to lower your calories. And if you're somebody that has lowered your calories dramatically in the past, there's a reason why you're here today. It's because it destroys your metabolism, and no matter what, lowering your calories will slow down the metabolism regardless. So it's a really good idea to have the approach of, I want to lower my calories just the least amount that I need to start budging in the right direction. And it should be slow and gradual. And that is the best way, the most sustainable way to get rid of fat, because as your body taps into those fat stores, as your muscles use more free fatty acids, over time, your body's going to change dramatically. It's just going to take consistency and time. And then, I personally recommend after 6 to 12 weeks, 12 weeks being the max amount of time in a deficit, it's usually a good idea, especially if your metabolic markers are screaming at you, like your temperatures are a little bit down, your pulses are a little bit down. At that point, it's usually a good idea to reverse diet, which means like get your calories back up to maintenance slowly, maybe by 50 to 100 calories a week. So spend the next 6 weeks reverse dieting, get back up to your maintenance, stay in your maintenance a little while, get your metabolic markers a little bit stronger, and then go back into a deficit. If you need more fat loss, you can go back into a deficit and do it again for another 6 to 12 weeks. And this is a much more sustainable way to create calorie deficits, because you're not going to cause so much metabolic stress that you're not going to be able to recover once you add calories back in. Because after a deficit, your body is really primed to put on fat. It was in a famine. And so you can't just go back to maintenance all at once. You have to slowly increase those calories so your body body learns to use those calories efficiently. And that's why I say like 50 to 100 calories a week max, and then, slowly get back up to your maintenance calories. And then, stay there for a little while. And then if you need another deficit, go in another deficit for like 6 to 12 weeks. And just repeat the process over and over. And I know it's like, oh man, that seems slow, that seems frustrating, but it's actually the best way to go about it, because you're gonna be able to still keep working on your metabolism while you lose fat. And it's not gonna be, when you're actually done losing fat, or you get to your goal place, you're not going to be so hormonally bereft that you're like, oh no, what do I do now? Like, your hormones will be in a pretty good place, and your body will be in a pretty good place, and you'll be ready to just enjoy the fruits of your labor. So to recap, remember, you can create a deficit by just working on restoring your metabolism, strength training, adding in more movement, focusing on your macronutrient balance, and if you need to, adding a little bit of a calorie deficit. And those are my 5 favorite ways to create deficits when you're trying to achieve hormonally supportive fat loss. But don't forget to build your strong metabolic foundation first. And, I might be biased, but I think that Fully Nourished, my online course, is the best way to get started with that and to learn about your physiology, learn about your hormones, learn about your body, and create that strong foundation so your body is resilient to the stressors that life throws at you. I hope you enjoyed video 4 in our fat loss series, and I'll see you next week for another video all about your biology, all about your hormones, and all about empowering you about your body.